cancer survivor. Now, I will say up front, a lot of people don't identify with that term or don't like that word in particular. But it's a word that's used in the medical literature to recognize that people are living a long time after the cancer diagnosis in many cases. And the National Coalition of Cancer Survivors back in 1986 coined the definition of cancer survivor, including anyone who's been diagnosed with cancer from the time of diagnosis through the rest of his or her life. And so that means at the very, very beginning, throughout the rest of one's life, they consider a person who's had cancer a survivor. In previous years, we used to look at the magical 5-year number as survivors who were completed active treatment in our 5 years post-diagnosis. But we have since learned that that's not a reliable indicator, particularly for cancer, or breast cancer, excuse me, because breast cancer, unfortunately, can occur immediately or as many as 20 years later. And that is unsettling on one hand. On the other hand, it speaks to how breast cancer in some cases has been transitioned to a chronic disease, if you will. So if you look at this graph on the left-hand side, 1975, that was prior to my beginning this work, we had 3.6 million cancer survivors of all cancers in the United States. And if you fast forward now to 2020, we have about 20 million cancer survivors, and we're expected by 2040 to have 26 million cancer survivors nationally. And so that's a significant change from 40 years ago, and that's important and exciting. We've certainly made more progress in some diseases than others, but in particular, and important to all of you, is that breast cancer is one of the diseases we've made the most progress in. There are a number of reasons for that, including the advocacy of the breast cancer community. We've also made progress with prostate cancer and making more and more progress with both colorectal and also surprisingly lung cancer, which that's kind of exciting. Working at the Knight Cancer Institute, I work among some scientists who have been involved with a lot of very significant changes relative to how we diagnose, how we treat, and how we understand the biology of cancer. So that's a hopeful thing. However, as all of you know, it comes with impact. So each of you enter the cancer experience with your own unique health history, your own resilience and strength. And also for some, they may enter the cancer experience already having other illnesses that they are navigating. But we know that there are side effects of all of our treatments that we offer. There's surgical side effects, chemotherapy side effects, such as peripheral neuropathies and fatigues and fatigue and chemobrain. There are radiation side effects. There are hormonal therapy side effects for women who were premenopausal and who have estrogen positive tumors. They often have to go into accelerated and early menopause, which comes with a whole set of its own challenges. And then other non-treatment specific side effects. So things like financial toxicity or, the burden in terms of changed relationships, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a little while. So these are the 4 areas that we're going to spend some time thinking about today, and later in our time together, I'm going to have you write down some notes for yourself about how you want to pay attention to these 4 areas. But for now, certainly when I'm talking with somebody who is dealing with a cancer experience, we care about quality of life, and that is something that when we're busily prescribing medication or radiation treatments or doing surgery, we want to make sure that the cure isn't worse than the disease itself. And I will tell you that all the research that is done in the cancer field always includes a quality of life measure, because we want to understand the impact not only of the disease itself, but the treatments that we're offering on quality of life. But the 4 domains that I always talk to my patients about are physical well-being, psychological well-being, social well-being, and spiritual well-being. And so that means different things to different people. But in the physical well-being domain, It's everything from functional status. You may not feel like you are as strong or as highly functioning as you were before you were diagnosed. Fatigue and sleep, we absolutely know that, especially for people who've had chemotherapy, sleep is really disrupted. Sleep is also disrupted by anxiety and worry. And we, in the old days, didn't quite understand what fatigue was. People would tell us that they had this profound sense of exhaustion. And in the old days, we would tell people to go home and nap and get a lot of rest and that sort of thing. But what we now know is actually fatigue and exhaustion are not the same thing. They're physiologically different mechanisms. And what can actually help with fatigue is activity. And so yesterday I had lunch with a colleague of mine who is an exercise physiologist, and she's a national expert in looking at how exercise can help reduce the impact of cancer-related fatigue. And it seems really counterintuitive. If you're feeling fatigue, who wants to go exercise? But what we know is that it actually is helpful. And so even if exercise means walking around the block, if it means taking your dog out, if it means, doing a little bit more each day, walking a little bit further, it helps. That helps. And it doesn't mean you have to become a marathon runner or anything like that. It's anything to keep moving that can really be very, very helpful. And again, cancer doesn't always occur in isolation. For others who may be carrying the burden of other diseases, that can be problematic or challenging as well. For younger women, fertility, it can be an issue after a diagnosis and treatment for cancer. And certainly not everyone emerges from the cancer treatment experience free of pain. And so those are things that we want to pay attention to as well. And how do we help take care of the experience of pain in any way that is possible to improve your quality of life? So for psychological well-being, and I'm going to talk a little bit later more specifically about things like anxiety and depression, but one of the things that we know can happen for people is when cancer is diagnosed, it's often out of the blue, and we have no idea why or how or why me or why now. And it gives many people a sense of a loss of control. And that in and of itself can be really devastating. I ran into a patient that I had worked with many years ago who I quote frequently, and he said, cancer didn't take away control, it took away the illusion that I had it. And I thought that was pretty profound. And so one of the things that can help us navigate this experience is figuring out what we do and don't have control over, and really focus on the things that we still have some choices about. And I will again talk a little bit more about the experience of anxiety and how we manage that, depression, also fear of recurrence. That is an almost universal experience for people who have had any kind of cancer, that the fear of it coming back. Did the treatment work? Will it continue to work? The end of treatment is often a really frightening transition point for people because of the fear of, if I'm not doing something actively to keep this cancer at bay, or if I don't have my cancer treatment team keeping a careful watch on me, how will I stay safe? And then cognition and attention. We also, not unlike fatigue, people have told us for years that they weren't always thinking clearly. And we just sort of assumed that it was because of the distress of cancer. But what we now know is that for people who experience or have chemotherapy, it can leave them with some brain fog and some difficulty with concentrating that is related to the treatment that we have given. And so there's some strategies that can be pretty helpful around dealing with what we now call chemo brain as well. Social well-being, we know that cancer doesn't happen in a vacuum. It certainly affects those of you who are diagnosed with the disease and have to go through treatment. But for anybody who loves you, we also know that there is distress for them. They love you, they worry about you, they may or may not know how to help. They may offer things that are well intended but not particularly helpful, such as saying just think positively, or other things that are, again, very well intended but may not be the most helpful in the moment. We know that cancer can change the roles that you've previously had, such as your ability to work, your ability to parent, your ability to be active physically again, and get together with people. And sometimes, I hear this a lot, that the people that we think are going to be there for us sometimes quietly disappear. And yet then conversely, people we were never expecting to show up. Sometimes it's other cancer survivors, sometimes it's people who just really come forward in ways that are really helpful. But in any case, there's often a lot of change that happens in relationships after the cancer experience. Sometimes in intimate relationships, affection, sexual functioning changes, and that can be really challenging for couples to navigate and find a way home. In the days when we could have in-person retreats, we periodically had couples retreats, because we know that cancer changes how people talk to each other, how they operate in their daily lives, and introduces a whole level of fear in the relationship that can be really hard to talk about. Other issues with cancer that have to do with our social well-being is our physical appearance. That can really change how we feel about ourselves, whether it's uh, physical functioning or lost body parts, or losing our hair as a result of treatment, or just not feeling ourselves. That can have an impact on how we show up in the world. And isolation, one of the things that the pandemic has really brought out of the closet is this sense of isolation that we feel when we can't gather, when we can't be together. And many cancer patients feel really isolated because others don't fully understand it. And as Myra said, being with others who get it makes all the difference in the world. I gave a talk for my professional organization about the impact of the pandemic on cancer treatment. And one of the things that I was saying is that we can learn from all of you who have been through treatment about how to continue to find resilience and show up in the world despite life having changed dramatically. And again, people who have survived cancer, I think, have really, in many ways, learned how to do that. Certainly, we know that for even for people who are well insured, cancer is very expensive. The out-of-pocket expenses, if one has to give up working, there's a lot in the cancer literature about what's called financial toxicity, and it's a huge issue for folks who are either underinsured or lack access to care, and also for those who have good insurance, the out-of-pocket expenses can be great, and so that's a whole other area that we want to pay attention to. And then finally, spiritual well-being. And this means different things to different people. So for some who have pretty active faith practices, their faith may be a place of support that's really helpful to them. For others, their faith may be challenged. I've done everything right, and so why is this happening to me? And I don't understand it. Has God given up on me? And also trying to figure out the meaning of all this. Again, I don't think that meaning is evident right away. It may be something that evolves over time, and it may change. And again, what I often will ask my patients is, what are you telling yourself about your cancer? Which is a little bit different than the question about why do you think you got cancer? If you ask why did I get cancer, there's usually not a very good answer. But when I ask, what are you telling yourself about this? It can really reveal a whole lot of other things. And it might be something as straightforward as, well, gosh, everybody in my family's had cancer. I was just waiting for my turn, to another kind of answer, such as, I haven't been really feeling like I've been taking care of myself. Or it may be something else, like I feel like I'm being punished for something. So, I think that's as a counselor, for myself, that's a place to start with people, to unravel the story and maybe create a different story about why this is happening to you or how you can get through it. For some people, they find themselves really in a transcendent state, meaning going to a place of deeper meaning and higher purpose, hope being balanced with uncertainty. And for many, finding strength that they never really knew that they had previously, which is, I think, a really important thing as well. So I gave a talk with some psychiatry trainees the other day about cancer still being what we call an affectively charged diagnosis. So even though we no longer have the taboo that once existed around talking about cancer, it's still scary. It's still one of the scariest diagnoses out there because there isn't a guaranteed cure. And so again, it also affects those around you who love you, whether it's directly or indirectly. And again, back when I started my career, cancer was really viewed as an automatic death sentence. I'm giving a talk next week to a conference in Wisconsin, and it's an interesting conference. It's all about the taboo topics of cancer. And the taboo topics are things like sexual dysfunction, thoughts of death, dysfunctional relationships, all of that. But my talk which is the kind of overarching one, is how we've come from a time of not talking about cancer to talking about it. But back then, when we didn't understand, we unfortunately made up stories about cancer that weren't true. And it ended up blaming people who were navigating cancer. So it's things like, did you not think positively enough? Or did you not have what it took to survive? It was very much victim blaming. And we did that a lot with diseases that we didn't understand. We did that with AIDS, we did that with tuberculosis, that we kind of made up narratives to help us make sense of something that we didn't understand. And so thankfully, we've come a long way since then. But nonetheless, I think cancer still carries with it fear around our own mortality, dread. And those are things that particularly in our culture, we prefer not to think about. And so cancer, it continues to be a scary diagnosis. And that's again, where I think recognizing how far we've come, seeing the science, being around others who are doing well can really provide a sense of hope and resilience. Most people that I work with talk about life before cancer and life after cancer. And I think it was you, Britton, who said, how does this, who am I now? How does this change us? And that's a very, very common question of, how has it changed us? How am I the same? How am I not the same? What do I want to let go of? Because in some ways, cancer gives us an opportunity to pause, to slow down, to think about things that we maybe wanted to change before cancer, but now in the context of cancer, have more incentive to do so. In the mental health field where I work, there's a whole study called crisis intervention. And that was developed back in the 40s after the Coconut Grove fires in New York, where many hundreds of people were killed in a nightclub fire because the doors, the emergency escapes were locked. And it was an enormous crisis. Many people died and families were very much in crisis. And we've learned two things from that experience in the mental health field, and we've continued to build on that since that time. We learned that in a time of crisis, people can come together, people can support one another, and also there may be an opportunity for some growth. Now that doesn't come all at once, but in Chinese, the two symbols for the word crisis are danger or wei, and gi, opportunity. And this is an exercise that when we do in-person retreats, we do as a group. And we put big charts around the room, and I ask the participants to talk about what are all the dangers or the losses that come as a result of the cancer experience. And once we've exhausted that list, we move over to the cautious opportunity list. And I say cautious because If I were to say to someone newly diagnosed with cancer, what's the silver lining, or what's the opportunity, or what's the blessing, chances are they'd be pretty angry with me, understandably, because again, I don't think this comes all at once. I think it takes time and recovery to get to a point of feeling like there may be some gifts in all of this. And I imagine you're thinking of some of this in your own lives. So examples are things like loss of health, the dangers, of course, literal loss of life, potentially, loss of independence, loss of a sense of security or safety, loss of a sense of efficacy or control, literally loss of body parts, financial issues. Often what shows up on this list are loss of friends, and any number of other things that you can think about. And then on the opportunities list, what we see are the opportunities for greater self-awareness. Something that comes up at, I think, every single retreat I've ever done are boundaries. We are women. We often are taking care of friends, aging parents, children, and if self-care is on the list at all, it's usually at the bottom of the list. And so after cancer, many, many women will say, I have a new appreciation for, I've got to set some limits. I've got these sort of toxic relationships that I need to set some boundaries around because they are just literally pulling life away from me. The opportunity to reevaluate what's truly most important in life, a new appreciation of life. During the pandemic, I have several older folks that I'm working with who are feeling like they're missing opportunities to live and travel and do the things they really wanted to do, and being elderly, recognizing they don't have as much time left as someone else might have. And so really wanting to appreciate life and thrive in the life that they have. For some, it offers renewed relationship priorities, and then also some spiritual perspective, which is unique to each of us, but something that may be an opportunity as well.